Welcome to Happily Ever After is just the beginning. Keeping your relationship not just together, but happy, and we mean truly happy, is part art and part science. You've come to the right place. Here's your host, Leslie Dories.
So anyone who knows me well knows one of my least favorite lines from a rom-com is the "You complete me" line from Jerry Maguire. It promotes the idea that if you can just find that one right person, your soulmate, then you will live happily ever after without a care or problem in the world. But what are the chances of finding your perfect match in a world of almost 8 billion people? And more to the point, how would you even recognize him or her if you had the good luck to stumble upon them? Real love, like principles, only exists when it's tested. It isn't really about perpetual happiness, and I think that's where most couples run into trouble. When anything less than never-ending bliss appears, the assumption that you are with the wrong person rears its ugly head. But what if there was something different at the foundation of successful long-term romantic relationships than infinitely being in love? Well, news journalist Jim Dalrymple is here to talk about alternatives to soulmate love. So, Jim, thanks for being on the show and talking about what I know is going to upset some people.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So let's just get right to it. You wrote a piece titled "Soulmate Love is Overrated." And again, we have you can hear sighs all over the place right now. So what actually is the premise behind this statement that soulmate love is overrated?
Yeah, of course. So the premise here is that people have been getting married, they've been falling in love, they've been having relationships for thousands of years. But for hundreds and thousands of years, people had sort of different priorities when they approached a relationship, like a marriage, for example. And so, like, if you look back in ancient Rome or a lot of cultures that were contemporary to ancient Rome, the goal wasn't to find sort of your soulmate and fall in love. The goal was to advance the goals of your family. You wanted to produce heirs, you wanted to improve your connections, you wanted to increase your holdings, these sorts of things. And that was pretty common at that time in the world. And the idea there is what some historians and sociologists refer to as the corporate family. Today, when we hear that phrase, we'll think of like the Waltons or, like a big billionaire type family. But in a simpler sense, the idea was just a family that's sort of working together to advance their interests, right? Like maybe they hold a house together, or like the classic example would be like a family farm or something like that. Anyway, so the goal of marriage in this period was to sort of advance the interests of the corporate family, and that carried over into the medieval period. It went up for a long, long time, and then over the centuries, there was social and economic changes, and they started to kind of shift the way people thought about marriages and love and that kind of thing. And so where you had in the past this idea that a couple were workmates or yoke mates, like this idea that they worked together, that was the main goal of a marriage. You wanted to work together. And I'm drawing a lot here from the historian Stephanie Coons, who's done a lot of great work on this. So throw her name out there. But this idea that there were workmates and yoke mates, you worked together. And then slowly, over time, people started to shift their priorities so that you became soul mates. And I think that the terminology is an interesting one because it really captures that this idea of soulmates is a very new one, really. It's only emerged in the last 100 to 300 years, sort of a gradual progression. But when you look at the grand scheme of history, like the 10,000 years of recorded history, that's really a very short time. Go ahead.
And it's really interesting because, when you think back to it, and I'm wondering, and we'll get to this in just a minute, I'm wondering as you're talking about this, how much of a role maybe the Industrial Revolution played. But, when you think about it, we would live in relatively, now obviously we've had big cities, Rome and Athens and London, and they've been around for millennia. They've been around for a really long time. Millennia, probably not, but you're living in this, in tribes in these relatively small areas, and so obviously, first off, who you can partner up with is limited because it's not like you could hop on an airplane back then, and
absolutely.
This idea of we need to band together to survive, literally survive. And so we want to get with people who either have more resources or are, the strong. I always think of, Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong.
Right.
This idea of we want to be able to have hybrid vigor so that our genes survive. And so it wasn't really it was more about survival than personal happiness, I'm assuming.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking when I met my wife and we were courting and that kind of thing, I was trying to decide if her music tastes aligned with mine, if we if we like the same movies, if we kind of had a similar circle of friends, and I'm sure that those were considerations throughout history, but yeah, also you needed someone who was going to provide for you, who was going to defend you, who was there were a lot of practical considerations, and that was very much a key component of marriages in various historical time periods, across various cultures in the West and not in the West. That was sort of this idea that people had to work together was really pivotal to marriage. It would be strange if we found an ancient Roman frozen in the ice and thawed them today, right? And they were walking around and they realized that those were not considerations to us so much today. I think that they would find that as alien to them as their ideas are to us.
So I want to continue down this kind of historical view because you actually talk about two very specific things in your article that helped change our ideas. So what role did the Catholic Church and also the Victorian era play in this idea of soulmate love?
Yeah, it's super fascinating. So I have approached this as a journalist, so I'm just kind of sort of peeling back the layers of the onion, right? And it's it's just endlessly fascinating to me. So, going back all the way to Rome, right, you had sort of a pagan society that transitioned into Christianity, but you still had kind of the same kind of corporate family, practical, workmate type marriages, and that extended into the early medieval period. But as the Catholic Church grew and sort of formalized its organization and that kind of thing, it started to need more money, and it needed that money to do good things. This isn't necessarily a nefarious plot, right? It needed to run monasteries and orphanages and to help people out and that kind of thing. I mean, maybe there was some nefariousness there somewhere, but they needed a way to generate revenue, and one of the ways that they discovered that they could do that is by sort of dismantling the kind of clan-based, tribal-based family structures that existed. So in other words, that corporate family idea. So instead of a sort of a patriarch or a matriarch, usually it's a patriarch in that period, of the family kind of determining who was marrying whom and where the family was going to spend its resources and that kind of thing, the Catholic Church implemented a variety of policies that whittled down family authority. And again, this is, I think this is interesting. I have some affection for Catholicism. This is not I don't say this to throw Catholicism under the bus. It's really interesting that the policies of the church, they sort of whittled down the kind of the tribal family structure and instead began placing more and more sort of individual freedom onto individuals. So instead of your parents choosing who you married, increasingly you got to choose. And instead of your parents determining what you did for your occupation in the future, increasingly you got to choose. And this was a process that took centuries. It wasn't overnight. There was there was key moments like the plague in the 1300s was like a really key moment and kind of later on shaping this evolution and that kind of thing. But the end result was that instead of strong family structures, you had church policies leading to the rise of sort of individualistic companionate marriages and people choosing who they wanted to marry based on who, their affections and that kind of thing. And it was really at this moment when that idea of soulmates supplemented that idea of workmates. And to me, it's so fascinating because it's like, at least, I remember when I fell in love with my wife, it was like, this feels just like such an inherent sort of intrinsic human experience, right? Like it didn't seem to me like some sort of construct or anything like that. But the framework that we're thinking in really is, emotionally maybe it's not, but like the idea that we can act on, like the soulmate idea really is the result of a series of policies that happened in, that resulted out of, like debates between French bishops in the medieval period. And so that's kind of the medieval period. And then, so you asked about the Victorian period too. And so like, as most people will realize, it wasn't, it's not like in the year 1400 or 1500, like arranged marriages ended or anything like that. But what you began to see, especially after the plague and as we move into the Renaissance, you start to see a more modern economic system come to be. And with that, you see wage labor rise. And the reason I mentioned the plague is because it killed so many people that there was a labor shortage, and the people who survived were able to earn more money, and that led to lots of great things long term, like the Renaissance. People had more money to spend on art and science, and like there was a lot of great stuff that eventually emerged out of this. But the result of a wage labor economy is that people were less dependent on their families. So you didn't have to wait to inherit the family farm or the butcher's shop in town or the blacksmith shop that your dad was running or something like that. You could move to the next town and earn a great wage and sort of work your way up into the bourgeoisie or something like that. And so this was sort of like a ball that got rolling in the late Middle Ages and sort of through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And then you see in the Victorian period, like in the United States, for example, even in the early 1800s, most families were still living in some sort of corporate family structure. Most people were farmers. Most people were still waiting to inherit the farm, or they were going to work in some way with the farm and that kind of thing. But when you see with like the Industrial Revolution, you see like just like this explosion of wage labor. And so you had people flocking to cities. And, we all learned about that probably in like, high school history class and stuff like that. But that continued this process that began in the Middle Ages of sort of disentangling the family from economics and financial concerns. So people were much more independent. And along with that, then you see sort of in the Victorian period kind of like a mental recalibration where, like there's this idea that men exist in kind of the professional sphere and women exist in the domestic sphere. But that's connected to the economics because suddenly the single breadwinner could exist. Whereas before, if you're on a family farm, like men and women might have different jobs.
Everybody worked.
They both had jobs. Like they had to do, they both had work. But in the Victorian period, suddenly it became possible for men to go outside of the house and do a job and support the family. And it's not to say women were doing less work. They really weren't doing less work, but it became redefined as not work. It became redefined as like this other thing that was sort of a domestic kind of labor of love. And there's a whole other discussion to be had about kind of like how this kind of like relegated women to a lesser role. But in a sense, that's it. Like I'm kind of rambling on here, but like that's the gist of this progress that led us right up until today, when wage labor is still sort of dominating the way we think about families.
That's absolutely true. So this is Happily Ever After is just the beginning on webtalkradio.net. and I'm having an interesting and important discussion about the drawbacks of soulmate love on the health of marriages, which we'll get to in a minute. And if you think your partner isn't the one, or you've lost some of the in-love feelings you once had, you're not alone, nor is that abnormal. But what it might be is a misunderstanding of what makes love in your relationship last. And if you're ready to learn what actually works, I invite you to take a moment and send me an email or give me a call and schedule your free, no obligation, Create Your Happily Ever After discovery session. You can reach me by email at Leslie, Lesli, at foundationscoachingnc.com. That's FOUNDATIONS, coaching, N as in Nancy, C as in Charlie.com. Or you can reach me by phone at area code 919-924-0463. Now, as I just said, we're going to talk about why soulmate love may be a problem. So, Jim, in your piece, you say that, quote, love is great until it's gone, which I love,
right,
unquote. Can you elaborate what you mean by that? Because I really think this is at the heart of where we get off track with just the soulmate stuff.
Agreed. I absolutely agree. And I think, it's interesting because, we were talking about sort of the history a second ago, and especially in the Victorian period, even into the early 20th century, there were people who were saying, love is becoming sort of the core foundation of marriage, but love can be fickle, right? Like you can fall in and you can fall out of love. And the problem is that if a relationship is just based on love, once the love ends, do you stay in the relationship or do you walk away? And, I've been in relationships I've walked away from before, but at a certain point that becomes very difficult, right? Like if you're married, if you have kids, if you have, shared assets, it becomes very messy. It can become very emotionally painful. And there were people who were sort of sounding the alarm as this happened. And I mentioned the historian Stephanie Coons a second ago, and she, she has suggested that like those people who were sounding the alarm in the 1800s, the 1920s, they ended up being right, that like love ended up being a somewhat weak foundation for marriage. Whereas if you contrast that with like the way marriages used to work, if you're workmates, right, like you might, your feelings of affection might ebb and flow, but there's a strong incentive to make that relationship work because not only is your sort of emotional well-being tied up in that relationship, but your economic well-being is as well. And that's not to say like corporate families and we're going to come back, we're all going to go live on the farm, but I think it's worth being aware that like the capriciousness of love is a new thing, and it historically would have been considered a weak foundation for a relationship because it can end, and that can torpedo not only the relationship but your finances. It can break up your kind of community of support. Yeah.
Well, which in reality is exactly what happens. And because I have this, because I will always say to people, your children cannot hold your marriage together, but they sure are a good reason to see if you can do it. And I do think that there is this true misunderstanding of being in love, which is a relatively short period where we're looking at our partners through rose-colored glasses and everything,
right?
Fantastic and beautiful, and aren't they perfect? And our friends are looking at us like we're insane.
Yeah.
And just the natural stages of love and what it means, and and it will ebb and flow because there are times when we don't necessarily feel all that wonderful gooey stuff, especially if you have a newborn who's keeping you up all night, and you're
right. I've got. Sorry, go ahead.
This idea that somehow we're doing it wrong. If I look at my partner and go, what are we doing here? Why am I with you? Because there are times when it's not all roses and sunshine and unicorns and flowers. And And, but if we have a commitment to it, then that's an incentive to work through it. But yeah, I mean, if we blow apart a family now, there's still a huge economic and emotional impact, not just to the two people, but to everybody who's associated with them, which I think is one of the reasons why this focus on, well, am I in love with you and am I happy at this moment is particularly problematic.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I'm married. I have 2 kids. I'm very much in love with my wife, but I remember in the early stages of our relationship, there's that sort of that hot love, right? That it's a different type of feeling. And like that, I do, to be clear, I very much love my wife, but like, it's a different type of feeling and it evolves over time. And, I think, the problem, I think, that the reason this history matters is because historically there was no expectation that you would necessarily love your spouse. Like there was a hope that love might blossom, and but it very much that was seen as something that would come after the marriage. And if it didn't come, that wasn't the end of the world. And a lot of people think today, like, oh well, that'd be horrible to be stuck in a marriage with someone I don't love. But the reality is that there was a much bigger support group. Like you didn't have, like That's today true. We focus all our energies on our spouse. They have to be our best friend, our lover, our financial partner, our co-parent, all of these different roles. And historically those roles were broken out into different people. Like your spouse and your best friend were absolutely not the same person. And if today they are, like that's fantastic. But I think that maybe like, the comforting thing about knowing this history to me is not that we're going to go back to arranged marriages or something like that, but that it can be okay if I have a best friend who is not my spouse. It can be okay if my feelings for my wife evolve over time. If like we have a 6-month-old right now, like we're in that phase where we're not getting a ton of sleep. It's not maybe like that hot moment of love, but like that's okay. Like that like knowing this history makes me realize that like the way I've been taught to think about relationships is just one of many options, and it's a rare and unique one. Like most people in history would have thought it was a strange one. And so injecting some of this historical kind of wisdom into the relationship for me, actually, I think it strengthens my relationship, at least in my case.
Well, and I do think I'm a proponent of information is power. And when we understand, and you talked about all of the things that now land in the lap of marriage, like, we're business partners, we're co-parents, we're lovers, we're friends. All of these things are now, and to me, I will tell people that is what makes marriage unique. And that is what makes it challenging because, we're equals in this. We come into this, nope, there's no hierarchy. It's not like parent, child, or boss, I mean, even in siblings, somebody's older. And, and so navigating this is really tough. And when we're only focusing on that the lover romantic part, which at times is not going to be the primary area. I mean, my thing is that it all needs to be in the it all needs to be in the pot, but this ingredient over here might be at this particular time might be more important, like when we're with younger children or getting older, wherever we happen to be in our life scale. So you talk in the article, you posit that maybe we're asking too much from our romantic relationships, and we're talking about some of the cost of that. But okay, I'm one of these things. Okay, so we were at arranged marriage, corporate family kind of thing on one end, and the pendulum has swung into this. My partner has to complete me. Pardon me. It makes my skin crawl.
Right.
They have to be my everything. So what's the alternative? What does the middle look like? Or is there even a middle?
I mean, I'm personally trying to find that myself right now, I think.
Right.
You know, like the article is part of like a project that I'm working on where I'm trying to sort of figure out what that middle could be. But I think that, you know, again, it's not like we're going to go back to the way life was in, you know, ancient
right.
Rome or, you know, something like that. Like that's not going to happen. But to me, at least, you know, like, it's like if I'm looking at from when I met my wife, I didn't know about any of this history, that kind of thing. Like we were sort of in that kind of soulmate paradigm, right? And we still are a little bit. But like if at a certain point in our lives we're more in a workmate paradigm, like that's still a valuable relationship. There's still meaning in that. And I think that you know, I'm not here to tell anybody what they should do with their own relationships, but like I think that if you find yourself working with your spouse more than, you know, being in like sort of that hot early stage, like to me, it's like I think I see this pattern. Like people live like that. They were happy in that world. Maybe we can be happy in that world too. Maybe we go through a few years where this is a workmate relationship, where we're yoke mates, where we've come to respect each other and work toward a common goal, even if, you know, we don't feel like we're, you know, 19 and, you know, falling in love in the backseat of a car or something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So like, I think that the middle ground is like picking and choosing from kind of our history, trying to understand what really worked for people, because this workmate corporate family thing, it existed for thousands of years. If it didn't work, it would have not lasted for so long. So there are elements that we can kind of pick and choose and bring into our existence now. Like, you know, I mentioned a second ago, like it's okay if maybe I have a best friend in addition to my spouse. And I think like I think sometimes, at least I think in my own relationship and the relationships with my friends and family, sometimes we feel like that there's like something missing, like in our circle, our social and familial circles. And the response is like, I'm going to double down and I'm going to do everything I can to make my relationship better. And that's a great thing to do, obviously, but
absolutely.
Of course. But maybe sometimes I think, and again, I'm speaking from personal experience. Sometimes I think that the actual gap wasn't between me and my wife. It was that I lacked a broader social network, and I was trying to make my wife serve all of those roles. And so going out and spending time with a friend or with, you know, my brother or one of my sisters or something like that, that time actually improved my relationship when I got back a few hours later with my wife. And so trying to kind of redistribute these roles in whatever way works for a person. I think, you know, there's like the saying, like, absence makes the heart grow fonder, right? Like maybe that absence is just 2 hours where you're catching a movie with your friend, or maybe, you know, like my wife has gone on vacations with her friends. Like these things, I think it takes a little bit of pressure off the relationship. And when the pressure's gone, I think that like the relationship can improve.
Well, and I think that's so critical because, you know, and you know, people think, well, this person, and I do think it goes back to expectations, right? If we're told, and then of course, you know, we have, you know, lots of inputs in this, and if this is the expectation, and you know, and maybe at the moment, or maybe even, you know, for a longer period of time than a moment, this isn't happening, then there's this panic that it's like, oh my gosh, this is wrong, this is bad, as opposed to, no, this is just a phase. And we can have input into it. And like you said, if something's missing, whatever that might be, let's take a look at what the options are, because it can be very exhausting to have this expectation that I have to be everything to this other person, which, by the way, doesn't exist. I'm sorry to burst that bubble for people, because one person can't be everything to another person. Now, maybe, okay, I mean, and maybe even if we were stranded on a desert island together, I'd probably need my own space. You know, it's like,
absolutely.
And so it's more recognizing that there's more options than arranged marriage, or I just have to find this one person in the world who's going to, light up my life from now until the end of time and never cause me any problems. Because, I'm about to.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it's like I'm about to celebrate my 35th wedding anniversary, and I now have 2 adult children. And so I've gone through this, and my husband and I have ebbed and flowed through all of that, where there have been periods where we've been closer together, and periods where we're just pushing the boat in the direction that we decided we needed to go in.
Right.
And and it's not a bad thing, but I think being aware of it and not just giving into despair, may be too strong of a word, but disappointment, to go, well, it's not working the way I thought it would. And it's like, okay, well, historically, yes, it is working the way it's supposed to. We just don't know that. So I find this a very interesting concept, and the idea that, trying to find this middle ground. And again, because me and my partner aren't necessarily going to be in the same mental, emotional place all the time.
Yeah, totally.
And we need, and having grace and understanding, and again, as my listeners are going to go, here she goes again, and communication about this is important.
Yeah, I think, this may be straying a little bit from the piece that I actually wrote, but I think about my own relationship, my wife and I got married pretty young. I was 25. I'm in my late 30s now. At the time I was like, this is who I am, like we've met, and I am who I am. I'm a grown up now, and we're going to get married. What I didn't realize is how much both of us would evolve over the years. I'm a totally different person today. I have different worldview. I've had different experiences, and we've evolved together. But I think it's also important for us, at least, to have allowed each other to evolve separately as well. The article that we've been talking about that I wrote, that's a project that I'm working on. My wife, I mentioned her in it, but she's not really involved in it. She has her own projects, right? We're still our individual people. And,
yes.
And I think that is a little bit more in line with the way people historically would have seen each other, is every aspect of their life didn't have to be intertwined. And, and I think that for us, at least, that's worked. I don't know if it works for everyone. It's worked for us, though.
Well, great. Well, Jim, thank you so much for this conversation. And can you tell people where they can learn more about, because you said this is like a project you're working on, so where they can learn more about this?
So I write a weekly newsletter. It's called Nuclear Meltdown, sort of same idea with a nuclear power plant or something. And the concept is that the nuclear family as we conceive of it today is maybe not serving us as well as maybe it could. So hence Nuclear Meltdown. And it's at nuclearmeltdown.substack.com. So again, nuclearmeltdown.substack.com. It's a weekly newsletter. It's totally free. You just put your email in, and you'll get it usually every Friday. And it covers all sorts of topics: love, work. It's sort of like the intersection of family and economics, and some personal essay and that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Well, cool. So we're talking about this soulmate and love, and so buying into the Beatles' "Love Is All You Need" is going to leave you and your marriage in potential peril, because love is a verb, not just a feeling, and you may desire to have it in your marriage, but it isn't going to be enough to keep your relationship on solid ground. It also isn't about grinding through your marriage, but about knowing what works and intentionally implementing it. That's what's going to keep it alive and thriving. So hopefully one of the things you're doing to keep your marriage alive and thriving is listening to this show. And until next week, stay loving.